The phone call that shattered my world came on a Thursday morning while I was grading math tests in my empty classroom. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and completely devastating. Ms. Rodriguez, this is Patricia Webb from Eternal Rest Cemetery. I'm calling about your father's burial plot. There seems to be a problem. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A problem. Such a simple word for what turned out to be the most twisted betrayal I'd ever experienced. My father, Roberto Rodriguez, had been laid to rest just 3 weeks earlier in what I thought was the family plot he'd been paying for since my mother died 15 years ago. Every month, like clockwork, he'd mail that check to the cemetery, sometimes struggling to make ends meet, but never missing a payment. "For you, mija," he'd always said, "so you won't have to worry when my time comes." But according to Patricia Webb, my father was buried in someone else's plot, and now the rightful owner wanted him moved. The nightmare began when Mrs. Webb asked me to come to the cemetery office immediately. Something about documentation discrepancies and urgent legal matters that needed my attention. I canceled my afternoon classes and drove across town to Eternal Rest, that sprawling cemetery where 3 generations of my family were supposed to spend eternity together. The cemetery office was a small brick building near the main entrance, filled with the kind of outdated furniture that hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Patricia Webb was exactly what I expected, a thin woman in her 60s with steel gray hair pulled into a tight bun and glasses that seemed permanently attached to a chain around her neck. She gestured for me to sit in the uncomfortable wooden chair across from her desk, which was covered with manila folders and what looked like very old ledger books. "Ms. Rodriguez," she began, shuffling through papers with the efficiency of someone who'd delivered bad news many times before. "We have a serious situation regarding Plot 247B, where your father was interred on March 15th. I felt my stomach drop. Plot 247B was supposed to be our family plot, the one Dad had shown me countless times during our Sunday visits to Mom's grave. He'd point to the empty space next to her headstone and joke about how he was paying rent on dirt he wasn't even using yet. But it's the best dirt in the place," he'd laugh, trying to make light of his own mortality. Mrs. Webb pulled out a thick folder and opened it with the gravity of a judge reviewing evidence. "According to our records, Plot 247B belongs to the Blackwood family, has belonged to them since 1987. The deed is right here, properly filed and witnessed." She slid a document across the desk to me. The paper was cream-colored and official-looking, with elaborate borders and legal language that made my eyes water. At the top, in elegant script, was written Eternal Rest Cemetery, Deed of Ownership. Below that, in smaller but equally formal text, was the plot number 247B and the name Marcus Blackwood as the purchaser. "This is impossible," I whispered, staring at the document. "My father has been paying for that plot since 2008. I have the receipts. I have the canceled checks." Mrs. Webb's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained businesslike. "I understand this is distressing, but Mr. Marcus Blackwood purchased this plot in 1987 for his late wife. His son, Derek Blackwood, recently contacted us because his father passed away last month and needs to be buried next to his mother. When Derek came to make arrangements, we discovered your father was already there." The room seemed to spin around me. "So you're saying my dad is buried in someone else's plot? How does that even happen?" "It appears there was an administrative error during your father's burial. The groundskeepers were directed to the wrong location. These things happen more often than you'd think, especially in older sections of the cemetery where the original mapping wasn't as precise as our current systems." I gripped the arms of the chair, trying to process what she was telling me. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Mrs. Webb's pause lasted just a beat too long, and I knew whatever came next was going to destroy what was left of my composure. "Mr. Derek Blackwood is requesting that your father be moved to a different location so his father can be properly interred in the Blackwood family plot." The words hit me like a physical blow. Move my father? Dig him up? Disturb his rest because of their mistake? The same father who'd worked double shifts at the factory to keep me in college, who'd never missed a parent-teacher conference even when he was exhausted, who held my mother's hand until her last breath and then visited her grave every Sunday for 15 years. Absolutely not, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. This is your mistake, not mine. My father stays where he is. Mrs. Webb adjusted her glasses and pulled out another set of documents. I understand your position, truly I do, but the Blackwood family has legal ownership of that plot. They've been quite patient, but Mr. Derek Blackwood has indicated he's prepared to take legal action if necessary. Legal action? I stood up so quickly the chair squeaked against the linoleum floor. Over your cemetery's mistake? Please sit down, dear. Let's see if we can work this out reasonably. She gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing. The cemetery is prepared to offer you a comparable plot in Section 400, which is quite lovely. We'll handle all the moving expenses and provide a new headstone at no charge to your family. Section 400? I knew exactly where that was. The new section, way in the back of the cemetery, where the plots were smaller and squeezed together like a suburban subdivision. Nothing like the peaceful, tree-shaded area where my mother rested, where my father was supposed to join her, where I had planned to eventually rest myself. My father has been paying for plot 247B since 2008. 15 years of payments. How can you possibly tell me he doesn't have a right to be there? Mrs. Webb opened one of the ledger books and ran her finger down columns of handwritten entries. I see payments recorded to a Roberto Rodriguez beginning in 2008, yes, but these payments were for plot 247C, not 247B. The plots are adjacent to each other. It appears there was confusion about which specific plot your father was purchasing. She turned the ledger toward me, pointing to a line of careful handwriting. There it was, my father's name next to plot 247C, not 247B. But something about the entry bothered me. The handwriting looked different from the entries above and below it, slightly more modern, as if it had been added later. This doesn't make sense, I said, leaning closer to examine the ledger. My dad would never have made a mistake about which plot he was buying. He knew exactly where my mother was buried. Grief can be confusing, Mrs. Webb said with practiced sympathy. Perhaps your father simply misunderstood which plot he was purchasing when he made the arrangements. But I knew my father better than that. Roberto Rodriguez was meticulous about details, especially when it came to anything involving my mother. He'd measured the distance from her headstone to the tree line, counted the steps from the main path, memorized the names on every nearby grave marker. There was no way he'd been confused about which plot was his. Something was wrong here. Very wrong. And I had the feeling that Mrs. Webb's tidy explanation was just the beginning of a much deeper deception. I need to see the original contract my father signed, I said firmly, and I want copies of every payment record you have. Mrs. Webb's smile became strained around the edges. I'm not sure that's necessary. We're trying to resolve this matter efficiently for everyone involved. Efficiently for who? Because it seems like the only people this is efficient for are the Blackwoods and this cemetery. My father is the one who's been making payments for 15 years, and my family is the one being asked to disturb our loved one's rest. I pulled out my phone and opened the note-taking app. I want documentation of everything. Every payment, every contract, every piece of paper related to my father's plot purchase. And I want to speak with Derek Blackwood directly. I don't think that's advisable, Mrs. Webb said quickly. These situations can become quite emotional, and it's better if all communication goes through official channels. That's when I knew for certain something was deeply wrong. In my 15 years of teaching, I developed a pretty good radar for when someone was trying to manipulate a situation. Mrs. Webb's insistence on controlling the narrative, her reluctance to provide documentation, her eagerness to push through a solution that benefited everyone except my family, it all felt rehearsed. Mrs. Webb, I said, placing my hands flat on her desk and leaning forward, I'm going to make this very simple. I'm not agreeing to move my father until I see every piece of documentation you have about Plot 247B and Plot 247C. I want the original deeds, the payment histories, and contact information for Derek Blackwood. If this is really just an innocent mistake, then you should have no problem providing that information. The woman's face flushed slightly, and she began gathering up the papers she'd spread across the desk. I'll need to speak with the cemetery director about releasing those records. These matters involve privacy concerns and legal protocols. Fine, then set up a meeting with the director. But until I see proof that my father doesn't belong in that plot, he's staying exactly where he is. I turned to leave, but Mrs. Webb's voice stopped me at the door. Miss Rodriguez, I hope you understand that the Blackwood family has considerable resources. If this matter goes to court, it could become quite expensive for you. I looked back at her over my shoulder, and for the first time since entering her office, I smiled. Mrs. Webb, you clearly don't know much about teachers. We're used to fighting uphill battles with limited resources, and we're very good at doing our homework. As I walked back to my car, my hands were shaking with a combination of anger and determination. Something was very wrong with this entire situation, and I was going to find out what it was. My father had taught me to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult, especially when it was difficult. I had 15 years of canceled checks in a shoebox in my closet, and a father who'd never made a mistake about anything that mattered to him. If Mrs. Webb and Derek Blackwood thought they could intimidate a grieving daughter into moving her father's body to cover up their own deception, they were about to learn just how stubborn Roberto Rodriguez had raised his little girl to be. The fight for Plot 247B was just beginning. That evening, I spread 15 years of my father's canceled checks across my kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle I was determined to solve. Each check was made out to Eternal Rest Cemetery in my father's careful handwriting, with Plot 247B in the memo line, not 247C. Always 247B. The earliest check was dated March 15th, 2008, exactly 1 month after my mother's funeral. I photographed every single check with my phone, creating a digital record that no one could dispute or mysteriously lose. The amounts varied slightly over the years as the cemetery raised their maintenance fees, but the memo line never changed. Dad was meticulous about record keeping, a habit he developed during his 30 years working in the factory's inventory department. If he wrote 247B, it was because that's exactly what he meant to write. Armed with my evidence, I called Eternal Rest Cemetery first thing Friday morning. Mrs. Webb wasn't available, but I managed to schedule a meeting with the cemetery director, James Morrison, for Monday afternoon. When I mentioned I had documentation regarding the Rodriguez plot dispute, his tone shifted from polite dismissal to cautious attention. The weekend crawled by with the speed of molasses in January. I found myself driving to the cemetery on Saturday morning, needing to see my father's grave with my own eyes. Plot 247B was in the Willowbrook section, a peaceful area shaded by ancient oak trees where the headstones dated back to the early 1900s. My mother's marble headstone read, Elena Rodriguez, beloved wife and mother, 1952-2007. Next to it, the fresh earth of my father's grave was just beginning to settle, marked by a temporary metal placard that read Roberto Rodriguez, 1948-2024. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind rustle through the oak leaves and trying to imagine how anyone could claim this wasn't where my parents belonged. The peace of the location, the mature landscaping, the sense of permanence, everything about the spot spoke to the careful choice my father had made when selecting their final resting place. Walking back to my car, I noticed something odd. Plot 247C, the one Mrs. Webb claimed my father had actually purchased, was directly behind Plot 247B, separated by a narrow walking path. But unlike the established section where my parents lay, 247C was in an area that looked newer, less developed. The ground was uneven and there were no mature trees providing shade. It looked like an afterthought, an area the cemetery had developed later to squeeze in more plots.
Monday morning couldn't come fast enough. I arrived at the cemetery office 15 minutes early, clutching a manila folder containing copies of all my father's canceled checks and a few surprises I discovered during my weekend research. James Morrison's office was larger than Mrs. Webb's, with mahogany furniture that looked expensive and diplomas covering one wall. James Morrison himself was a distinguished man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of smooth demeanor that probably worked well with grieving families. Mrs. Webb was also present, sitting in a corner chair with her own folder. She gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good afternoon, Miss Rodriguez. I hope you've had time to reconsider our generous offer regarding relocation." "Actually," I said, opening my folder, "I've had time to do some research, and what I found is very interesting." Morrison gestured for me to sit in the leather chair across from his desk. "Please, tell us what you've discovered." I pulled out the first set of copies and laid them on his desk. These are copies of every check my father wrote to this cemetery from 2008 to 2024. As you can see, each check clearly indicates plot 247B in the memo line, not 247C as Mrs. Webb claimed on Thursday.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Mrs. Webb shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Furthermore," I continued, pulling out more documents, "I requested a copy of my mother's burial records from 2007. According to your own paperwork, Elena Rodriguez was buried in plot 247A. Now, I may not be a cemetery expert, but common sense tells me that if my mother is in 247A, my father would want to purchase the adjacent plot, which would be 247B, not 247C, which is across a pathway in what appears to be a completely different section." Morrison nodded slowly. "That does seem logical. Mrs. Webb, can you explain the discrepancy in our records?" Mrs. Webb opened her folder and pulled out the same ledger book she'd shown me on Thursday. "The handwritten records clearly show payments for plot 247C. Perhaps Mr. Rodriguez was confused about the numbering system." I pulled out my phone and showed them the photos I'd taken at the gravesite. "This is plot 247C. As you can see, it's across the walkway in an undeveloped section with no mature trees and uneven ground. Does this look like the kind of plot a man would choose to be buried next to his beloved wife?" Morrison studied the photos, then looked at Mrs. Webb with a furrowed brow. "Patricia, can you show me the original deed for the Blackwood family plot?" Mrs. Webb hesitated for just a moment before reaching into her folder. She pulled out the same cream-colored document she'd shown me on Thursday, but as she handed it to Morrison, I noticed something I'd missed before. The paper looked old, but not 37 years old. The edges weren't yellowed with age, and the ink looked too fresh for a document from 1987. "Mr. Morrison," I said carefully, "would it be possible to see the original cemetery records from 1987? Not copies, but the actual filing documents from when the Blackwood families supposedly purchased plot 247B? Morrison and Mrs. Webb exchanged a look that lasted just a fraction too long. "I'm not sure we still have records that old in their original format," Morrison said. "Most of our files from the 1980s have been digitized or transferred to newer filing systems." I pulled out another document from my folder, one that had taken considerable effort to obtain over the weekend. "That's interesting, because I contacted the county clerk's office on Friday. They maintain records of all cemetery deed transfers as part of the public record. According to their files, there's no record of any deed transfer for plot 247B to a Marcus Blackwood in 1987. In fact, their records show that plot 247B was part of an undeveloped section until 2007, when it was first sold to Roberto Rodriguez. The silence in the room was deafening. Mrs. Webb's face had gone pale, and Morrison was staring at the county clerk's document like it might burst into flames. "Furthermore," I continued, pressing my advantage, "I spoke with my father's original burial agent, Martha Gonzalez, who retired last year. She remembered my father very well because he came in
every year to update his burial preferences and ensure everything was properly documented. According to Martha, my father specifically requested Plot 247B because it was adjacent to my mother's grave in 247A. She has no record of any confusion or mix-up regarding plot numbers. Morrison cleared his throat. These are serious allegations, Miss Rodriguez. Are you suggesting that our staff has been deliberately misleading about the ownership of this plot? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts based on public records and witness testimony. The question I have is why Mrs. Webb has been trying to convince me that my father bought a different plot when all evidence points to the contrary. Mrs. Webb finally spoke up, her voice noticeably tighter than before. There must be some misunderstanding. The Blackwood family has been clients of this cemetery for decades. Derek Blackwood specifically requested Plot 247B for his father's burial. I pulled out my final document, the one that had taken me most of the weekend to track down. That's another interesting point. I did some research on Derek Blackwood. According to public records, Derek Blackwood filed for bankruptcy 18 months ago. His construction company failed, and he lost his family home to foreclosure. Now, I'm not an expert on cemetery plots, but I imagine a prime location in the Willowbrook section would be quite valuable, especially if someone needed quick access to cash. Morrison's eyes widened slightly. What exactly are you implying? I'm implying that someone saw an opportunity when my father passed away. An elderly man with no other family besides his daughter, the teacher who probably wouldn't have the resources to fight a legal battle. Someone figured they could claim his valuable plot belonged to another family, force me to move him to a less desirable location, and then sell the prime real estate to the highest bidder. Mrs. Webb stood up abruptly. This is outrageous. I don't have to listen to these accusations. Sit down, Patricia, Morrison said firmly. His tone had changed completely, and for the first time I sensed that he might actually be on my side. Miss Rodriguez, these are very serious allegations. Do you have any direct evidence linking Mrs. Webb or Derek Blackwood to this alleged scheme? I reached into my folder one more time and pulled out a piece of caper that had been tucked behind all the others. Actually, I do. This is a real estate listing I found online this weekend. Derek Blackwood's construction company might have failed, but he's apparently started a new business buying and selling cemetery plots. According to this advertisement, he specializes in acquiring prime burial locations for discerning families and has several plots available in the Willowbrook section of Eternal Rest Cemetery. Morrison snatched the paper from my hands and studied it intently. Mrs. Webb had gone from pale to green, and she was gripping the arms of her chair like she might fall over. "There's more," I said, enjoying the shocked expressions on their faces. I called the phone number on this listing yesterday and spoke with Derek Blackwood directly. I pretended to be interested in purchasing a cemetery plot. He specifically mentioned that he had a plot in the Willowbrook section that would be available soon, once he resolved a minor paperwork issue. He quoted me a price of $25,000. Morrison set the listing down and stared at Mrs. Webb. "Patricia, I think you need to explain what's going on here. Right now." Mrs. Webb's carefully constructed composure finally cracked. "I don't know anything about Derek's business dealings. He approached me a few weeks ago claiming his family owned Plot 247B. He had documentation. Documentation you've admitted looks suspiciously new for a 37-year-old deed," I pointed out. Morrison walked to his window and looked out at the cemetery grounds. When he turned back to face us, his expression was grim.
Miss Rodriguez, I owe you a profound apology. It appears that someone has attempted to defraud both you and the cemetery. Mrs. Webb, you're suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Security will escort you from the premises. Mrs. Webb's mouth opened and closed like she wanted to protest, but no words came out. She gathered her papers with shaking hands and left the office without another word. Morrison sat back down and looked at me with what appeared to be genuine remorse. I want you to know that Eternal Rest Cemetery will cooperate fully with any legal action you choose to pursue. Your father will remain in Plot 247B, where he belongs, and will ensure that his burial site is protected from any future claims. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was mixed with anger at what my family had been put through. What happens to Derek Blackwood? That will be up to the district attorney's office. Fraud, attempted grave tampering, conspiracy, there are multiple charges that could apply here. We'll be turning over all our records to the authorities. As I drove home that afternoon, I thought about my father and how proud he would have been of the way I'd fought for him. Roberto Rodriguez had taught me that the truth always comes out eventually, but sometimes you have to dig for it. Today, I'd done exactly that, and justice had prevailed. But something told me this story wasn't over yet. Derek Blackwood was still out there, and desperate people often make dangerous decisions when their schemes fall apart. 3 weeks later, Derek Blackwood called me directly. His voice was shaky, desperate, nothing like the confident businessman I'd spoken with when I was pretending to be a customer. "Miss Rodriguez, we need to talk. There's been a terrible misunderstanding." I was grading papers in my classroom after school when the call came through. "Really? What kind of misunderstanding involves forging cemetery deeds and trying to dig up my father?" "Look, I know how this looks, but I was desperate. My creditors were threatening my family. When Patricia mentioned there might be an issue with your father's plot, I thought maybe we could work something out. I never meant for things to go this far." The irony wasn't lost on me. Derek Blackwood, who'd tried to exploit a grieving daughter's vulnerability, was now begging for mercy from the same person he'd attempted to victimize. "So you admit you conspired with Mrs. Webb to steal my family's burial plot?" "It wasn't supposed to be stealing. We thought maybe there really was confusion about the plot numbers. Patricia said the records were unclear, and I figured if we could just relocate your father to a different section, nobody would get hurt." I set down my red pen and walked to my classroom window, looking out at the parking lot where my father used to pick me up when I was student teaching. Nobody would get hurt. Derek, you tried to force me to dig up my father's body based on fabricated documents. You traumatized a grieving family for money. I know. But listen, the district attorney called me yesterday. They're talking about felony fraud charges. I could go to prison for 5 years. I have 2 young kids, Miss Rodriguez. Please, isn't there some way we can resolve this without involving the courts? This was the moment I'd been waiting for without realizing it. The moment when the person who'd tried to exploit my grief faced the consequences of his actions. But as I listened to Derek Blackwood's panicked breathing on the other end of the line, I heard something else. I heard my father's voice, the way he used to talk about second chances and forgiveness. "Derek, let me ask you something. When you were planning this scheme with Mrs. Webb, did you ever think about what it would feel like if someone tried to disturb your father's grave for money?" The silence stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Finally, he whispered, "My father died when I was 12. He's buried in a veterans cemetery in Ohio. If someone tried to move him..." His voice broke. "God, what have I done? You made a choice to hurt people when you were scared and desperate, but now you have a chance to make a different choice." "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, channeling every lesson my father had taught me about justice and mercy. "I want a full written confession detailing exactly how you and Mrs. Webb planned this fraud. I want you to contact every family whose plots you've tried to manipulate through your cemetery business and make full restitution. And I want you to establish a fund for cemetery maintenance in my parents' names." "That's it? You won't press charges?" "I didn't say that. I said you have a chance to make things right. The district attorney will ultimately decide about charges, but your cooperation and restitution might influence their decision." 6 months later, Derek Blackwood pleaded guilty to attempted fraud and received 2 years of probation, along with community service requirements. Mrs. Webb was terminated and faced her own legal consequences. The cemetery implemented new verification procedures to prevent future fraud attempts. But the real resolution came on a sunny morning when I visited my parents' graves. Plot 247B now had a beautiful granite headstone reading, "Roberto Rodriguez, beloved father and teacher of justice, 1948 to 2024.
The inscription below read, "He taught his daughter that truth always rises to the surface." Next to their graves, a small bronze plaque marked the establishment of the Elena and Roberto Rodriguez Memorial Fund for cemetery beautification. Derek Blackwood's restitution payments would maintain the Willowbrook section for the next decade, ensuring that other families wouldn't have to fight for their loved ones' peaceful rest. As I placed fresh flowers on both headstones, I realized that my father had gotten the last word after all. His meticulous record-keeping and my determination to honor his memory had exposed a scheme that could have hurt countless other families. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, but the knowledge that someone loved you enough to fight for what is right even after they're gone. The case became something of a local legend. Other families came forward with similar suspicious contacts from Derek's cemetery business, and the investigation expanded to include multiple plots and thousands of dollars in attempted fraud. My story was featured in the local newspaper under the headline, "Teacher's Homework Assignment Exposes Cemetery Fraud Ring." Derek Blackwood eventually moved his family to another state and started over in a legitimate construction job. He sent me a letter on the anniversary of my father's death, thanking me for showing mercy when I could have pursued maximum punishment. "You saved my children from growing up without their father," he wrote. "I'll never forget that." I kept that letter in my desk drawer, next to the final canceled check my father wrote to the cemetery. Some lessons take a lifetime to learn, but the most important ones are worth the wait. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.